Okay, it is probably about 10 o'clock on Halloween night. I had just as a matter of course, decided not to do a video tonight because I have a lot to do before I go to bed and I'm sleep deprived and I have a big day tomorrow and a big rest of my week. But then I remember that these are supposed to be like a discipline. I'm actually doing these things despite their being mildly inconvenient because I know they're going to be good for me in the long run. And it's also Halloween, and I've been wanting to share some of Charles Williams for a while because I am falling more and more in love with him daily, basically. So Charles Williams was a friend of C.S. Lewis's, one of his closest friends, especially later on in his life, and he kind of took Tolkien's spot, from my understanding, took Tolkien's role as best friend for C.S. Lewis. And Tolkien never forgave him for that, but also never forgave Charles Williams because Charles Williams was pretty heavily involved in the occult, which I don't think Tolkien appreciated. But Williams was a Christian, a very ardent believer in Christianity, but then also was a member of several secret societies, and then I think ended up founding his own one, which I don't know enough about to talk about, but he was an interesting character, all that to say, and Lewis was heavily influenced by Williams, and so much so that he wrote That Hideous Strength, Lewis did, and it's very much like basically a book that sounds like Charles Williams, and then a lot of his other fiction draws from the interesting and unique ideas of Williams as well. But from what I have found in reading his books, as I've been doing for the past 4 or 5 years, because I read one a year at Halloween, and I bought all 7 of his novels from the lovely editions that the Williams Society puts out. I have nice little interiors, really quality binding and pages, and hardcover, really lovely things. But what I found is that his prose are extremely complicated for my mind to understand, but they have a lot of depth and beauty and intricacy in them, and so that's like you can keep learning more and more things about it. And I've particularly enjoyed listening to the Inklings Variety Hour podcast, in which they've been talking about the book that we'll talk about today. It's just opened my eyes to a whole bunch of new facets of it that I hadn't been able to appreciate because just there's so much happening, and I'm honestly not a very good reader, so I'm excited to grow in these respects. But I thought I would start off with a quick little introduction to him through a book that I'll read next year for Halloween, which is crazy to think I might have my PhD by that time. But this book is called War in Heaven, and I've looked at the first line only, and it's just a lovely first line. It says, "The telephone bell was ringing wildly, but without result, since there was no one in the room but the corpse." I just love that. I think that's a great way to start a book, and it really shows Williams' style, I think, in part. One thing that happens a number of times is as things get more supernatural or spiritual or, I think, insane, his prose switch from clear, lucid, smooth, flowing prose to, like, what I described in the margins of my book as the chattering of cogs, the chattering of the cogs of broken sanity. And I think that happens a number of times where things just like you feel the person's mind just kind of breaking down, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I'll start with this one little quote. Not little. It's like everything in Williams takes a long time to say. It's a couple pages that are describing a girl's encounter with her doppelganger that's haunted her for her whole life. She's walking down the street and trying to avoid the doppelganger and afraid that it's going to show up out of nowhere. And she's counting the houses throughout this passage. She's counting down to the one until she gets to her own, because when she's in her house, it doesn't show up to her. But it's just terrified her whole life. And yeah, we'll start into this. And I don't know, it's such a complicated thing to read. I might have to like cut this a bunch of times so that you have a smooth listening to it, but we'll find out how it goes. Her name's Pauline, in case it mentions that. not to think of something else, if she could. It was so hopeless. She was trying not to look ahead for fear she saw it, and also to look ahead for fear she was yielding to fear. She walked down the road quickly and firmly, remembering the many thousands of times it had not come. But the visitation was increasing, growing nearer and clearer and more frequent. In her first 24 years, she had seen it 9 times. At first she had tried to speak of it. She had been told, when she was small, not to be silly and not to be naughty. Once, when she was adolescent, she actually had told her mother. Her mother was understanding in most things, and knew it. But at this, the understanding had disappeared. Her eyes had become as sharp as when her husband, by breaking his arm, had spoiled a holiday in Spain which she, for all their sakes, had planned. She had refused to speak any more to Pauline that day, and neither of them had ever quite forgiven the other. But in those days, the comings, as she still called them, had been rare. Since her parents had died, and she had been sent to live with and look after her grandmother in Battle Hill, they had been more frequent, as if the hill was fortunate and favorable to apparitions beyond men, a haunt of alien life. There had been 9 in 2 years, as many as in all the years before. She could not speak of it to her grandmother, who was too old, nor to anyone else, since she had never discovered any closeness of friendship. But what would happen when the thing that was she came up to her, and spoke or touched? So far it had always turned aside, down some turning, or even apparently into some house. She might have been deceived were it not for the chill in her blood. But if some day it did not. A maid came out of her house a little farther down the road and crossed the pavement to a pillar box. Pauline, in the first glance, felt the sickness at her heart. Relieved, she reacted into the admission that she was only 23 houses away from her home. She knew every one of them. She had not avoided so much measurement of danger. It had never appeared to her indoors, not even on the hill, which seemed to be so convenient for it. Sometimes she longed always to stay indoors. It could not be done, nor would she do it. She drove herself out, but the front door was still a goal and a protection. She always seemed to herself to crouch and to cling before she left it, coveting the peace which everyone but she had. 21, 20, she would not run. She would not keep her eyes on the pavement. She would walk steadily forward, head up and eyes before her. 17, 16, she would think of something, of Peter Stanhope's play, A Terrible Good. The whole world was for her a canvas printed with unreal figures, a curtain apt to roll up at any moment on one real figure. But this afternoon, under the stress of the verse and then under the shock of Stanhope's energetic speech, she had fractionally wondered, a play? Was there a play? A play even that was known by some? And then not without peace? 10, 9. The Magnus Zoroaster. Perhaps Zoroaster had not been frightened. Perhaps if any of the great, if Caesar had met his own shape in Rome, or even Shelley, was there any tale of any who had? 6, 5, 4. Her heart sprang. There, a good way off, thanks to the merciful God. It was. Materialized from nowhere in a moment. She knew it at once, however far. Her own young figure, her own walk, her own dress and hat. Had not her first sight of it been attracted so? Changing, growing. It was coming up at her pace. Doppelganger. Her control began to give. 2. She couldn't run, lest it should. Nor did it. She reached her gate, slipped through, went up the path. If it should be running very fast up the road behind her now? She was biting back the scream and fumbling for her keys. Quiet! A terrible good. She got the key into the keyhole. She would not look back. Would it click the gate or not? The door opened and she was in. and the door banged behind her. She all but leant against it, only the doppelganger might be leaning similarly on the other side. She went forward, her hand at her throat, up the stairs to her room, desiring, and every atom of energy left denying that her desire could be vain, that there should be left to her still this one refuge in which she might find shelter. I think that's good. So that was just the end of chapter 1. So I'm not like spoiling anything by showing you a doppelganger. But for that to be a way that you kind of start a book too, just a few pages in, I think that's exquisite. That was the scene. When you read it in the context of the whole thing, and when you're reading it in your mind and visualizing it, it got my heart rate elevated, and I've never had a book do that before, and so I like that a lot. But that's just one small part of this book, and which is full of crazy, intense scenes like that that become more and more meaningful. And they're not all bad. A lot of them are intense, but they're not all bad. There are a lot of rough ones, but like she's talking about a terrible good, and that's a theme through this book, and I think Williams in general. So I'll leave it to you if you desire to find out what that terrible good is in a book that's called Descent into Hell. But to spoil one plotline a little bit, I will talk about the Descent into Hell, and I think this is a super valuable part of this book for me. It describes a man named Wentworth, a historian, a second-class historian. He's the second best historian in a certain small particular field. But it describes him choosing himself, I guess, over and over, and therefore kind of driving himself into hell. And he keeps dreaming that he's climbing down a rope, lit kind of by moonlight, and is tethered above, and he thinks it's tethered below, and he's just climbing hand over fist down this rope, which eventually, spoilers, kind of leads him into the hell. But it's just by these little gradual movements that he has, that he sends himself into oblivion, basically, by the end of the book. And you get to see glimpses of it in a few key moments, and one of them is here. Wentworth is an older man, and he has been interested in a young lady named Adela. And Adela was maybe interested in him, I don't really remember, but she became more interested in another young man, and that's totally fine. But Wentworth doesn't handle that very well, and when she cancels kind of a meeting with him, he follows her and finds out that she's going out with this other guy instead, and is just maddened by that. So he goes back and he finds a bit of mail, or a bit of a newspaper about his rival historian, who he dislikes, but you can see how he responds to it here. Having just had the rebuff from this girl, essentially, he comes back already kind of in a fragile mental state of hurt pride and this frustration that she's following her own path instead of what he wants from her, which is to have her. So it says, his eyes stared interiorly. Exteriorly, they glanced down and saw the morning paper, which, by an accident, he had not opened. His hands took it up and turned the pages. In the middle he saw a headline, Birthday Honors. In a smaller headline, Knighthood for Historian. His heart deserted him. His puppet eyes stared. But they found the item by the name in black type for their convenience. Aston Moffat, the other historian, obviously. There was presented to him at once and clearly an opportunity for joy. Casual, accidental joy, but joy. If he could not manage joy, at least he might have managed the intention of joy, or, if that were also too much, an effort towards the intention of joy. The infinity of grace could have been contented and invoked by a mere mental refusal of anything but such an effort. He knew his duty. He was no fool. He knew that the fantastic recognition would please and amuse the innocent soul of Sir Aston, not so much for himself as in some unselfish way for the honor of history. Such honors meant nothing, but they were a part of the absurd dance of the world and to be enjoyed as such. Wentworth knew he could share that pleasure. He could enjoy. At least he could refuse not to enjoy. He could refuse and reject damnation. With a perfectly clear, if instantaneous, knowledge of what he did, he rejected joy instead. He instantaneously preferred anger, and at once it came. He invoked envy, and it obliged him. He crushed the paper in rage. Then he tore it open and looked again and again. There it still was. He knew that his rival had not only succeeded, but succeeded at his own expense. What chance was there of another historical knighthood for years? Till that moment he had never thought of such a thing. The possibility had been created and withdrawn simultaneously, leaving the present fact to mock him. The other possibility, of a joy in that present fact, receded as fast. He had determined then and forever, that he would hate the fact, and therefore facts. He walked unknowingly to the window and stared out. He loomed behind the glass, a heavy bulk of monstrous greed. His hate so swelled that he felt it choking his throat, and by a swift act transferred it. He felt his rival choking and staggering. He hoped and willed it. He stared passionately into death, and saw for him a body twisting at the end of a rope. Sir Aston Moffat. Sir Aston Moffat. Ugh. So, obviously, a small choice that he did just to feel frustrated that he didn't get a knighthood that he didn't know he could possibly get. But such a meaningful decision, and one of many small decisions that lead him to where he ends up. A really potent thing. And I don't have time, but I kind of want to continue reading more. I might try. And if you don't see more of this, then I cut it off because it gets too crazy. Like, I read too poorly because there's a lot of pages of crazy stuff happening. But what happens next, I think, is one of the more intense things. And I'll just maybe skim it. But basically, he's very frustrated at this. And then someone comes to the window, and it's the voice of Adela. And yet something's different about it. Something's a little bit wrong with it. And it's because he has summoned this false Adela, kind of like the false Duessa, which hopefully we'll talk about from the Fairy Queen sometime. But this false synthetic version of this girl that he supposedly liked. And he conjures it up, and then the next number of pages of them just kind of walking together, her kind of coddling him, saying that he doesn't think enough of himself. And then it gets a little spicy, and he ends up, she's like a succubus, and he ends up just kind of being absorbed into his life with her, so much so that when he goes out in public, he doesn't really register what's going on. All he wants to do is get away from the society and get back to his fake Adela. And then eventually, he kind of rejects Adela for himself purely. And then at the end of the book, when he runs into Sir Aston Moffat at a party, he just loses himself entirely. And you might think I'm spoiling the whole book, and I might be spoiling part of it, but so much happens in this book that, like, it's much more intricate than I just described. So you should still read this book. I barely spoiled anything. I mean, it's in the title. But I don't know. I might not try to read any more of this, just because if I do, I don't know where I will stop. Because I would like to read the ending of his descent, but that's really long and complicated. And there's another section where he decides to choose himself versus community again. But here, I'll read a little bit about his encounter with this false Adela that he conjured up because he has rejected facts and he's choosing this sordid fantasy. He hears the patter of footsteps coming up the road. A little way up it stood a woman's figure. The thing he had known must happen had happened. She had come. "I'm here," the voice said. As he came nearer, he was puzzled again, as he had been by the voice. It was Adela, yet it was not. It was her height and had her movement. The likeness appeased him, yet he did not understand the faint unlikeness. For a moment he thought it was someone else, a woman of the hill, someone he had seen whose name he did not remember. He was up to her now, and he knew that it could not be Adela, for even Adela had never been so like Adela as this. Let's skip down a little bit. "Who are you? You're not Adela," the voice said. "Adela." And Wentworth understood that Adela was not enough, that Adela must be something different even from Adela if she were to be satisfactory to him, something closer to his own mind and farther from hers. She had been in relation with Hugh, the other guy, the younger guy, and his Adela would never be in relation with Hugh. He had never understood that simplicity before, but it was so clear now. He looked at the woman opposite and felt the stirring of freedom in him. Later on it says she laughed. The laugh was a little like Adela's, only better, fuller, more amused. Adela hardly ever laughed as if she were really amused. She had always a small condescension. He said, something irrelevant, because I didn't read that part. And she said, you don't think of yourself enough, she said. The words were tender and grateful to him, and he knew they were true. He had never thought enough about himself. He had always wanted to be kind. He had wanted to be kind to Adela. It was Adela's obstinate folly which now outraged him. He had wanted to give himself to Adela out of kindness. He was greatly relieved by this woman's words, almost as much as if he had given himself. He went on giving. He said, if I thought more of myself? And then they go on a walk, and then a faint mist grows around them, and they go, and it says, but here in the mist under the trees, with this woman, it was all clear. The mist made everything clear. And they go into this crazy little, section where he's kind of hallucinating, it seems like, in a lot of ways, and he's like drunk with power to kill everything that wasn't him, and then hoping that she survives. And she does, because it says she doesn't need air because she's not real. And later on it says he died to things other than himself. He woke to himself. Anyway, I could go on like this for a long time. And honestly, I don't feel qualified to do so, because I only slightly understand this book. But I think it's a perfect read for Halloween, because there is hope and new catastrophe and redemption to be found in the pages. And two of the chapters, I think, are even called the doctrine of the doctrine of substituted love. I just turned to a random chapter and it's called that because a couple of them are called that. So it's like, it's full of interesting theology and principles and spiritual ideas. But I think a great read for Halloween. Still, all of his books are, they're not all great, but that one, and I think All Hallows Eve are, fittingly, two of my favorite ones that I've read of his thus far, but I've got two more left to go. So anyway, I'm going to stop rambling there. Hopefully you're able to track some of that and didn't feel too bothered that I spoiled it a little bit. But there's so much that happens in the book, I suggest you check that one out in particular, The Descent into Hell. Anyway, I'm going to go because I got to make some stuff to study population dynamics with students this week, and then prepare for my readings. So, have a lovely Halloween. People who happen to be having Halloween right now. All right.